All right, so I had a request for factoring. They've forgotten some of their factoring. So I'm actually going to show a couple of ways. If it gets monotonous, if it gets whatever, you just stop this video. This is, remember, only for your help. Um, so let's dive right in for factoring. When we have A is 1, meaning that the number out front is 1, do not overthink factoring. That means that both of your variables for factoring is going to be n. What multiplies to get 12 and adds to get 8. When everything's positive, we know that it has to be positive, no worries. And so that means that, let's see, 4 plus 3 is 7, so it can't be that one. It can't be 12 and 1 because that's 13. But it can be 6 and 2. Okay, so nothing fancy has to happen. The other methods that I'm going to show for 4, 5, and 6 can always be used, meaning that you could use the methods on numbers 1 and 2, but I find them to be unnecessary because they're just too much. Okay, so the second one, quickly, again, we set it up. They're both B's. We want to know what multiplies to get 12 and adds to get negative 7. The only way that I can add to get a negative but multiply to get positive would be same signs. I did not plan this, but there are my factors. So I know that it's going to be 4 and 3. Okay. Another example is if this is negative, you're actually looking at what subtracts to get that number, because adding a negative is the same thing as subtracting. Okay, sometimes you need to factor out a greatest common factor first. So notice all of these have 2 in common. Also notice they have an x squared in common. So when I say factor out, think undistribute. Not a real word. If you've had me before, you know I use that word, but also tell you it's not an actual vocabulary word. But 2x squared times what would give me 2x to the 4th? Well, that's x squared. 2x squared times what would give me negative 8x cubed? Well, that's negative 4x. 2x squared times what would give me negative 64x squared? And that would be negative 32. And then I could factor leftovers here. And here's an example where I have a negative. So that means I'm going to have 1 positive and 1 negative. And maybe you're drawing a blank, so you literally have to sit down and do all the factors, right? Okay, which of those using subtraction would give me 4? Why subtraction? Because that's the only way I'm going to get a negative number here. And then the bigger number always goes with the middle sign. So that's how I know the order there. All right, now into the fun stuff. Okay, there are 3 main ways. There's actually a whole lot more than that. But you may have, actually 4 now that I think about it. You may have been taught snowflake. You may have been taught box method. You may have been taught something called slide and divide. And you may have been taught something called split the middle term. Which is where we literally split the middle term. Okay, no matter which way you use, the first thing you've got to do is, so this one's kind of big, 7 times 12 is what? 84. Okay, I need to know what multiplies to get 84. So multiplies to get 84 and adds to get negative 23. 5. And actually, this is going to be a negative because your A is positive and your C is negative. Okay. If you are struggling to make your list of factors, so what do I mean by list of factors? This was a list of factors for the previous problem. If you're struggling, you can take your graphing calculator and in the y equals, take your number, so negative 84, and divide it by x to figure out. This gives you a list of factors when you look at your table. So second graph. Which of those, when added together, will give you negative 25? Well, that's 3 and negative 28. That was really easy instead of having to write that whole list. All right, so going back. Three and negative 28. Now, depending on which way you use, you're going to use that differently, okay? So if I'm using Snowflake, I actually have a spot to put the negative 84 and the negative 25 to remind myself what multiplies to get this number and adds to get this number. Then I always put A in the top corners of the snowflake. So this is always A. Then, which we've already done the heavy lifting here, I have to think what multiplies to get negative 84 and adds to get negative 25. Well, that's 3 and negative 28. Then I think of these as fractions. Hopefully you can see that those are fractions. Okay, 7/3 does not reduce, but 7 over negative 28 does reduce to 1 over negative 4. Always keep your negative where it was. I understand that when you reduce that, the negative will pull to the front on your calculator. That's not what we're getting at. That's fine. Okay. Then we're ready to write our factors. So we always write our factors as the top, and then x, and then the bottom. So in this case, it would be 7x plus 3, because the fraction was 7/3. Our second one, we do use the reduced form, so we're going to use this one. 1x minus 4. Okay, so that's how you do Snowflake. People who just like to have a system and they don't care why it works typically likes Snowflake. But if you are a person where you want to know why and how does this work, you may not like Snowflake as much. Box method is very similar. So box method, you still have to know these two things, but there's not a cool place for it to go. Box method, you also put the first term in the square, so in this case 7x squared, and you put the last term in the last square. And then those two numbers that you found that multiply, so remember I said no matter what way you do, you have to think about this part first. So the two numbers we found that multiply to get negative 84 and add to get negative 25 were a positive 3x and a negative 28x. And then we undistribute everywhere, okay? So, aka factor out. 7x squared, 3x. Well, that only has an x in common. Negative 28x and negative 12, well, that has a negative 4 in common. And if you don't like factoring out, you really only have to think about one place to factor out, because then I can think about multiplication. So x times blank is 7x squared. Well, that's 7x. X times blank is 3x. Well, that's 3. 7x times blank is negative 28x. That's negative 4. And then double check, negative 4 times 3 up here at the top is negative 12. So then I have my factors written across the top and down the side. So 7x plus 3 and x minus 4. Either way works. Okay. Slide and divide looks like you always start with x. You can put a plus here if it makes you happy. This time, a is going to go on the bottom. Okay. Just like all the others, I needed to know what multiplies to get negative 84 and adds to get negative 25. Our numbers were negative 28 and 3. So if I can divide, I divide. So notice your first one, x, and then negative 28 divided by 7 is actually negative 4. 3 divided by 7, I can't actually divide, so that's when I slide. I slide the denominator to the front. So then I have slide and divide. This one is very simple, but I have found that students, when they use this one, the disadvantage to this one would be they forget what goes up there. How do I find what goes up there? Because there's not a systematic place to remember what those two numbers are. So those two numbers are the numbers that multiply to get a times c and add to get b. Okay. And the last way is the oldie but goodie. This is the very first way that I learned not to do, that there was something out there besides guess and check. Because when I was in high school, they taught me guess and check, and there was no other method in my brain. So life was difficult. Again, the disadvantage here is you got to remember what are the two terms that multiply to get AC and add to get B. 3x and negative 28x. And so this one oftentimes is called splitting the middle term. I know it as AC method just because that's what my college professor called it. But same thing. You're going to take those two factors and put an x with them because you're splitting the middle term. So notice, if I told you to simplify that line that I just wrote, if I told you to simplify it, it would give you the original function we were doing. Okay? Now I have 4 terms, and I can do what's called factor by grouping, where I look at just these two, and then I look at just these two together. So looking at the yellow highlight here, what do 7x squared and 3x have in common? Well, that's an x. And then I'm left with 7x plus 3. Okay, next part, negative 28x minus 12. What do they have in common? Well, they have a negative 4 in common. Okay, what are my leftovers? So if I undistribute that negative 4, what am I left with? 7x plus 3. If you do this correctly, these two should always match. Okay, and that is one of your factors. And your other factor is what I call the leftovers. So in this case, x minus 4. Okay, so pick your favorite way. If you are just a guess and checker, that is okay. What that means is that you just open up 2 of these and you play, you think, all right, 7, the only numbers are 1 and 7, so I know one has to be 7 and one of them has to be 1x. And then you look at that last number and you think, all right, what are all the things to multiply negative 12? Well, let's see, negative 4 and positive 3. All right, let me multiply that out and see if I get that back. Nope, I don't. Let me do it again and again and again. If that's your method, that is fine. Like I said earlier in this video, that's actually the only way that I knew existed for a long time. But sometimes it hurts your brain, especially when you have numbers that you're not sure about. If you want to go over more problems or try, different problems, here's a couple more. This video is already lengthy because of all the ways I went over it. So if you just want to, hit pause and try these 2 problems to see if you can get it. If you still have no idea and you need a Zoom time, I will gladly set that up as well.